Well, good morning, everyone. I can almost see you. Really just delighted to be here and honored, actually, to be here. And all of you are one of the great assets of the Jewish people today. And I just want to thank all of you for what you do, for your determination and courage, and to thank Jonathan for your leadership, your friendship, and we're truly blessed to have you, Jonathan. Rather than be tempted to deal with the admittedly fascinating details of the last few days in Israeli politics, I'm going to force myself to sidestep those issues and focus instead, in the time that we have, on some long-term trends that I believe we need to pay careful attention to. And the first of those trends is the emergence of the Israeli center as a powerful force in our politics. In fact, those of you who paid attention to our recent elections will have noticed that the Israeli political divide is no longer characterized by right versus left, as it was for decades, but by right versus center. And this is an historic shift that requires a little bit of unpacking, and I think that American Jewry really needs to pay closer attention to this political transformation, because it tells us an enormous amount about where Israeli society is heading, and more to the point, who I believe the natural allies are for the mainstream American Jewish community. So let's unpack that for a little while. The left has, in effect, imploded. The left is no longer able to present itself as a credible alternative party or power force of government. The Labor Party in these last elections got all of 6 seats. 6 seats out of 120 seats. Bear in mind that this is the party that founded the State of Israel, that could not be defeated for the first 3 decades of Israel's existence. We were a multi-party system all those years. We had 40, 50 parties, and yet in effect we were a single party, and that was Labor. The party that founded the state was the state. And the transformation of Israeli politics began in the fateful year of 2000. And that was the moment when the vast majority of Israelis concluded that our conflict with the Palestinians is not actually about 1967 or about resolving the consequences of 1967, but in fact about 1948, that for the Palestinian national movement, in all its factions, a Jewish majority state in any borders is still illegitimate. And so for the Palestinian national movement, the long-term goal remained undoing not just the consequences of 1967, but the consequences of 1948, which is to say, the existence of Israel. This is a normative Israeli narrative of why the Oslo process collapsed. And I often find when I come to the American Jewish community that I'm in a kind of time warp. And much of the Jewish community has not yet internalized the sea change of the year 2000. And I would compare, in terms of its political and psychological impact on this generation of Israelis, I would compare the year 2000 to the years 1947-48, and its impact on the founding generation of Israelis. That was the moment when the founding generation realized that this is an existential war, and a similar process happened to the Israeli public in the year 2000. When I say that the parts of the American Jewish community are in a time warp in relation to where Israeli politics has evolved to, the only place where I really encounter groups like Breaking the Silence or B'Tselem, the far left wing of of the Israeli political map are in parts of the American Jewish community. For all practical purposes, these groups have no presence on the Israeli political map. Now, I'd like to explain a little bit about what I mean by the center. What does the center believe? What is the Israeli center? And my starting point is that the center is that place that has internalized the left-right debate, which, as I said earlier, for many decades really did define the Israeli political divide. A centrist believes essentially two things about the conflict with the Palestinians. The first is a left-wing insight, which is that occupying another people is a disaster not only for the Palestinians, but also for us, for all the reasons and more that you know. Preserving Israel as a Jewish majority state with democratic values, our status internationally, our moral status, transferring occupation as a way of life from one generation to the other on both sides. For all those reasons, a centrist believes that the left was right in warning about the consequences of ruling over another people. But a centrist not only has a left-wing side, we also have a right-wing side. And I say we because this is the camp that I have identified with for many years. And the right-wing side of the centrist persona believes that the Palestinian national movement rejects our legitimacy. And therefore, you can't make peace with a Palestinian national movement that doesn't accept your right to exist. And so if you put those two insights together, the conclusion is we must have a Palestinian state, and we can't have a Palestinian state. That's where most Israelis are at today. Or certainly, that defines the center. To put it another way, and I've often used this analogy, as a centrist, I have two nightmares about a Palestinian state. The first nightmare is that there won't be a Palestinian state. You see where this is going. And that is that the occupation continues another generation. It becomes a permanent facet of our lives, and it fundamentally distorts Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And the second nightmare is that there will be a Palestinian state. Hamas moves Gaza to the West Bank, and then our most sensitive border, the border with Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, becomes our most difficult border to defend. Now, the emergence of the center has also, I think, a very important message for American Jews. Because American Jews today, I would say, are divided in terms of their relationship to Israel by two different kinds of anguish. There is, quote, the left-wing anguish in relation to Israel, and that anguish is, how is it possible that the Jewish people, with 4,000 years of history, telling ourselves the story year after year that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, don't do to others what was done to you, how is it possible, not only that we have become long-term occupiers of another people, but how is it possible that more and more Israelis seem not to feel anguish about it? So the left-wing anguish is anguish at the absence of anguish among so many Israelis. The right-wing anguish is expressed very differently, and that is, how is it possible that 70 years after the Shoah, we find ourselves again in a situation where we are defending our right to exist? How is it possible that what used to be called the Jewish question has now been resurrected in different form? How is it possible that the question of legitimacy, right to exist, applies to only one country in the world that has a question mark over that issue, and that is the Jewish state? The centrist sensibility effectively combines these two forms of anguish and struggles with ourselves. We've internalized the left-right debate so that it's not happening anymore outside between two rival camps, as it still is among much of American Jewry, but it's happening inside each of us. The struggle between left and right happens inside each centrist being. Now, the second crucial political development that emerged in these most recent elections is the transformation of part of the right. I would even go so far as to say a significant part of the Israeli right into the hard right, into a right wing that no longer feels that democracy is an essential component of Israeli identity, a non-negotiable component of Israeliness. And this is new, and this is really a profoundly worrying turn of events. Now, it's true that this is happening all over the world. I hear rumors that even in this country there's some concern about civility and political discourse, but I have never been worried in the past about the vitality and the future of Israeli democracy, and I am worried today. In the last election, we saw an assault on democratic institutions coming from the prime minister, coming from leaders of other right-wing parties. Naftali Bennett, our former education minister, came up with a slogan for his party that we will deal with Hamas and the Supreme Court. Now you have to understand the Hebrew nitapel, the Hebrew word deal with, has an edge to it. We will deal with both Hamas and the Supreme Court. I have lived in Israel for close to 40 years. I have never heard that kind of anti-democratic rhetoric coming from a mainstream Israeli party. The most obvious example of the threat to democracy that is coming from within the Knesset itself is the passage about half a year ago of the nation-state law. I'd like to spend a moment just unpacking the problematics of that law, because what is a problem with that law is not understood by its opponents, and its defenders are missing a crucial point about what really is the threat in that law. The problem with the nation-state law, from my point of view, is not what's in the law, but what's not in the law. And what's missing from the law is a definition of Israel as, in addition to being the state of the Jewish people, to being the state of all of its citizens, to being a democratic state. If you are going to pass a law that defines the essence of the state, and you define the essence of the state only as either a Jewish state or a democratic state, you are doing profound violence to who we are and how the founders of the state envisioned what the Jewish state is supposed to be. Now, if you read the Declaration of Independence, my reading is very simple. The founders envisioned the future state of Israel to be two things. On the one hand, it would be the state of all Jews, whether or not they are actually citizens of Israel. And it would be the state of all of its citizens, whether or not they are Jews. The state of all Jews, whether or not they are citizens. The state of all citizens, whether or not they are Jews. If you define Israel as one or the other, you do violence to the vision of the founders, and you negate the expressed spirit of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the defenders of the law noted that we didn't need to explicitly define Israel as a democracy because we have a basic law that was passed in the 90s. Our equivalent of constitutional laws are called basic laws. And there is there is a basic law that defines the rights, the democratic rights of every Israeli citizen. But that does not address what this law addresses. This law defines the identity, the essence of the state. And it does so only as a Jewish state. If you are going to pass a law defining our identity and you don't include democracy, what you are in effect saying is that democracy is a utilitarian means of government, rather than being what the founders of the state envisioned, which is that democracy is as essential to our identity as being a Jewish state. And any attempt to upend that balance threatens the very being of Israel. Now, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves how extraordinary Israeli democracy is. What a miracle that we should never take for granted. And when I say that Israeli democracy is a miracle, I know of no democracy in history that was born in war and that never knew a moment's peace since. We have been subjected repeatedly to wars, the constant threat of wars from almost any of our borders, ongoing terrorism from before the creation of the state all the way through till this week, diplomatic siege, boycott. No country has been subjected to such relentless assault, and yet not only have our democratic institutions prevailed, but I would argue that today in 2019, despite the growing assault against our democratic institutions, Israel today is a more vigorous democracy than we were in our early years. Far more democratic press, far more democratic and pluralistic society. The Mizrahim are now equal parts of the society, which was not true in the past. Arab Israelis, while we still have a long way to go, nevertheless have made significant progress since the early years of the state. And then when you factor in the wave after wave of Jewish refugees who entered into this permanent pressure cooker and came from societies with no democratic tradition, either from Eastern Europe or from the Middle East, which is 90+% of the Israeli Jewish population, then you realize just really how miraculous not only the persistence of Israeli democracy is, but its enhancement. But when I say that Israeli democracy is a miracle, I don't only mean that in a celebratory sense, but also with a certain amount of anxiety. Because a miracle is a defiance of the laws of nature. A miracle, in other words, cannot be taken for granted. A miracle needs to be nurtured and protected. And what we are seeing in Israel today is the opposite, coming from the very top. One more political trend that has emerged in recent days that I think is worth noting because it is more than just a passing moment. It is, in fact, a long-term trend. And that is the change in the nature of the religious-secular divide, which since the founding of the state, and one could even argue in the pre-state era, was one of the defining debates and divides within the Zionist movement and then later the state. The old divide between secular and religious is over. Now, I'm going to repeat that line. The old divide between secular and religious is over. The new divide is between ultra-Orthodox and everyone else. This is a profound historical transformation, and it tells us several things about Israeli society. First of all, it tells us that there has been a convergence between parts of the religious Zionist community, I would say a majority of the religious Zionist community, and the secular community, so that the intense enmity or the open question that really defined Israel's culture wars in the 50s and 60s, is Israel going to have a real relationship with Judaism? Is Israeli identity going to be, in some sense, Jewish identity, at least for the Jewish part of Israel? That question has been resolved. Judaism, Jewishness is an essential part of Israeli identity, and there is no question about that anymore. The question is what kind of identity? And here, the ultra-Orthodox dilemma becomes acute. Because what has now happened is that the pressure is on, and I see this as a very positive long-term development. The pressure is on in trying to figure out ways to absorb those parts of the ultra-Orthodox community that will want to become part of the Israeli mainstream, and those segments of ultra-Orthodoxy are growing. And so the next great struggle will be figuring out a way of how do we bring the ultra-Orthodox or parts of the ultra-Orthodox into Israeli society. And there, the mainstream is divided, and I feel this way as well. I'm really of two minds. Do we pressure them? Do we force them to join the army, for example, to enter into the productive economy? Or do we allow the pressures of normal events to influence that community? But that is the new struggle that is now taking center stage, and that's the significance of Avigdor Lieberman's break with Netanyahu and forcing a showdown on the ultra-Orthodox issue. What I would appeal to all of you today to take seriously is an alliance between the mainstream American Jewish community and this emerging Israeli center, which has a chance to reshape the Israeli political scene. And that is an alliance based on defending democracy, defending Israel's identity as the state of the Jewish people and the state of all of its citizens. It is an alliance that will be based on stopping certainly this next government, if it is right-wing, from annexing parts of the West Bank, as we've heard Netanyahu say he intends to do, because that is the beginning of the end of a two-state solution. Now, when I say a two-state solution, I need to emphasize that almost no one in Israel today believes a two-state solution is possible anytime soon. And so the position of the center is no to annexation and no to a delusional peace now. Instead, what we need to do is keep our options open. Keep the possibility, the long-term possibility, admittedly, of a two-state solution open, and not gradually slide toward a one-state, to my mind, a one-state disaster, a dissolution. And finally, we need an alliance between the Israeli center and the mainstream American Jewish community against the reemergence of anti-Semitism from both the right and the left. And in the terrific talk that we heard earlier between Barry and Emma, Barry touched on the question of which is the greater threat, left or right, and I would just like to offer a few addendums to what was said here. And the first is that when we ask the question, which is the greater threat, is it coming from the anti-Zionist left, or is it coming from the radical right? The answer is that it depends where the question is being asked. If the question is being asked at this moment in this country, then yes, the lethal threat to Jewish lives is most likely to come from the far right, although that could change. We could, God forbid, see a radical Islamist act of violence. But at this moment, in this place, the far right is the greatest immediate threat. But if you ask the question in France, in England, you're going to get very different answers. And we heard that from Jonathan yesterday. In England, and I think that England is the most important diaspora story today, the future of the British Jewish community. Because there we are seeing literally an existential threat coming from the far left. I spoke recently to a group of British Jewish students who were visiting Jerusalem, and we were sitting in a circle, 25 students, And I asked them, how many of you would consider leaving, emigrating, if Corbyn became prime minister? 23 out of the 25 hands immediately shot up, and the other 2 were unsure. And so we are looking at the very real possibility, if Corbyn, God forbid, becomes prime minister, of the beginning of the end of one of the venerable diasporas in the West. Those voices, those progressive Jews who would want us to focus only on the threat of the far right, and we hear those voices, are effectively trying to remove American Jewry from a global Jewish struggle against anti-Semitism. Because if it is only about the far right, then it's only about American Jewry at this moment, rather than seeing the reemergence of anti-Semitism in a much more complicated and global context. And if I could add something to what Barry said about what is anti-Semitism, and I think this is really one of those moments where we need to be very clear about defining what it is that we're up against. So my definition of anti-Semitism is that it is the transformation of the Jew into symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as its most objectionable qualities. And so, as Barry said, under Christianity, the Christ killer, under Marxism, the Jew is capitalist, under Nazi, the Jew as emblematic of the anti-Germanic spirit, as they understood it then. And in the era of universal human rights, when the most detestable qualities, the most loathsome traits are racism, apartheid, Israel, the Jewish state, becomes the symbol of, surprise, racism and apartheid. Israel today, the Jewish state, is the most hated country in the world. And I think that we need to let that sink in, because it's an extraordinary turn of events. The fact that the UN condemns Israel more often than all other countries combined should tell us what it is that we're facing, and it should remind us of an old historic pattern. The threat of anti-Zionism is that it has declared war against the Jewish story. And I see that as an existential threat, because my definition of who the Jews are is that we are a story that we tell ourselves about who we think we are. And that's why the seminal Jewish ritual is the Seder. No matter how far away you are from Jewish observance, chances are you'll find your way to a Seder. Because that's the moment when we retell our story, we go back to our origins and try to make sense of this 4,000-year story we've been carrying. And so to turn our story into something evil is a threat, and I see it as the greatest long-term threat, if not to individual Jewish lives, as the far right poses today, but it is the great threat to the Jewish people as a collective. The great victory of the post-Holocaust era, the great Jewish victory, was our ability to reclaim power. In Israel, we reclaimed hard power, military power, and in America, you reclaimed soft power, the power of building alliances, coalitions, of lobbying, of deploying philanthropy strategically. Both of those forms of power, of our ability to defend ourselves, are now under assault. And so in order to contend with this moment, we will need courage, resolve, and a commitment to the moral values that always defined us as a people. And those are qualities that define you as an ADL community. And for that, I'm deeply grateful to be here today and to be your partner. Thank you very much.